I remember the day I married Rachel as if it happened yesterday. We were standing under the oak tree in her grandfather's backyard, exchanging vows with sweaty palms and pounding hearts. She wore a simple lace dress that hugged her figure perfectly, while I fidgeted in a suit I borrowed from my brother because I couldn't afford a better one. That day felt like a blessing, like every hardship and heartbreak I'd endured before was just leading me to that moment. I was sure that I'd found the woman with whom I would share my entire life. Children, a house with a yard, maybe a dog or two. For years, we were solid, or so I thought. But now, as I sit here alone in this half-empty living room, I realize how little I truly knew about the woman who claimed to love me. Everything changed when she disappeared. It wasn't like her to skip out on our plans or ignore my calls. She was always organized, borderline obsessive with her schedules. If I came home 5 minutes later than usual, she'd already be pacing around the living room, wondering if something had happened. So, the first night she never came home, I filed a missing persons report out of sheer panic. I couldn't reach her by phone, her friends hadn't heard from her, and her office reported that she had abruptly requested a leave of absence. Days bled into weeks, and my worry morphed into fear and anger. Where was she? Why didn't she say anything to me? I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I spent hours driving around the city, checking every motel, hospital, and police station, desperate to find her. My mind began to conjure up wild scenarios. Maybe she was kidnapped, or perhaps she'd met with an accident. The police told me they had little to go on, no signs of forced entry at our home, no suspicious activity on her bank statements, and no ransom calls. Meanwhile, my parents urged me to stay strong, to consider therapy, or at least lean on friends for support. But the truth is, I started to hate anyone who gave me hollow words of comfort. I was drowning in questions, and no one could throw me a lifeline. My mind wandered back to every conversation Rachel and I had in the last few months. Had she dropped hints? Did I miss some subtle clue that she was planning to leave me? I found myself replaying our last argument about something trivial, whose turn it was to buy groceries. She had been uncharacteristically quiet afterward. Now, I wondered if she'd already been plotting her escape, even while I was cluelessly planning our next weekend getaway. 3 weeks crawled by with no word. I felt the hollowness of each passing day like a physical ache in my chest. Then, one Sunday morning, as I was dragging myself through the front door after a sleepless night, I saw her. She was sitting in the kitchen, her hair disheveled, wearing the same clothes she'd left in weeks ago. My heart raced with confusion and relief, followed by a surge of rage. "Where have you been?" I shouted, voice cracking under the weight of my pent-up fear. She glanced up, her eyes filled with an emptiness I'd never seen before, and offered no immediate explanation. Instead, she asked if I could get her some water. That request felt like a slap in the face. I wanted answers, not domestic chores. Yet, I obliged, because despite everything, I still needed to know she was physically okay. When she finally spoke, she admitted she'd gone away to clear her head. No explanation about where or why, just a vague mention of needing space. I was too tired to fight, too drained to question her further in that moment. I paced around the kitchen like a restless animal, collecting my thoughts, wondering if I should call the police to let them know she'd returned. Then, without warning, she grabbed my arm and mumbled something about a confession. My pulse quickened. A confession to what? My mind raced through every possibility. Was she pregnant with someone else's child? Was she addicted to something? Had she killed someone? I braced myself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared me for the words that came out of her mouth next. "I've been cheating on you for 4 years because I was bored." I almost dropped the glass I was holding. I stood there, silent, for what felt like an eternity. 4 years! That was nearly half our marriage. She sat with her head bowed, tears streaming down her cheeks, as though she expected me to comfort her. The twisted irony made me sick to my stomach. Questions peppered my mind. Who was it? How did it start? Did all those nights I fell asleep next to her mean nothing? Instead of unleashing my fury right away, I found myself eerily calm. I pulled out a chair, sat across from her, and asked her to explain. She stammered through a series of half-baked excuses. She felt unfulfilled. She wanted excitement. She didn't know how to talk to me about her dissatisfaction. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears, feeling as if each word was a fresh betrayal. And then, in a tone disturbingly devoid of shame, she said, "But I want to come back now." Her audacity was staggering. Come back now, as though she'd merely gone on a brief vacation without telling me. My jaw clenched and my fists tightened under the table. But I refused to shout. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I told her to leave, to get out of the house she had so thoroughly desecrated with her betrayal. She begged, claiming she had nowhere else to go, that she realized her mistake and wanted to fix our marriage. The gall of her words ignited something fierce inside me. Yet, a cold, detached part of me took over. I repeated, calmly, that she needed to leave. Her tears fell harder, and she tried to reach for my hand. I recoiled as if her touch were poison. Eventually, she gathered her keys and stumbled out the door, leaving me with nothing but the stench of her confession. For days after that, I lived in a fog. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. The woman I had shared nearly a decade with had just confessed to a 4-year affair and vanished once again. My phone buzzed incessantly with her calls and texts, each message more desperate than the last. She proclaimed she loved me, that she'd made a mistake, that she was willing to do anything to prove it. But every time I thought about responding, I remembered how calmly she'd admitted that she was bored. It gnawed at me, the idea that my love, my devotion, had been so insufficient that she sought thrills elsewhere. I didn't know how to handle the breadth of my fury. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and worst of all, ashamed. Ashamed for not seeing it sooner, for trusting so blindly, for letting myself become a fool who never questioned his own wife. At some point, anger replaced my despair. I told myself I needed answers, not just from her, but from whomever she had been seeing. I wasn't sure how to find them, but I started by going through her phone records. It was surprisingly easy. I remembered her login credentials from the time we had merged our cell phone bills. The first number that appeared repeatedly over 4 years belonged to a man named Gregory. I didn't know him personally, but I recognized the name vaguely from a company event Rachel had dragged me to. He'd been the guy who kept winking at her during the presentation, though I brushed it off as my imagination at the time. My heart pounded as I continued scrolling. The calls were constant, often at odd hours. Even more damning were the text messages, hundreds of them per month. My stomach churned as I realized the depth of her betrayal. I wrestled with the idea of confronting Gregory directly. Part of me wanted to march into his office and beat him senseless. Another part, the calmer side, insisted that the real blame lay with Rachel. She had been my partner. She was the one who vowed fidelity. Still, I felt an undeniable pull toward vengeance. Something in me refused to let this go without a fight. I didn't want her back, not after everything, but I wanted them both to taste the humiliation I was drowning in. I started tailing Gregory, memorizing his schedule, even hacking into his social media to get a sense of his personal life. He was single, living in a condo downtown, and had a string of casual flings. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became that my wife had chosen such a shallow man to throw away our marriage on. One evening, I found myself outside Gregory's condo. I had no clear plan, just a furious need to face the man who'd been sleeping with my wife for 4 years. My hands trembled as I rang the buzzer. He answered, sounding mildly annoyed, until I said I was there to talk about Rachel. Silence followed, then a buzz granting me entry. When he opened his front door, I saw confusion in his eyes, as though he'd never expected me to show up in his life this way. I walked in, ignoring his offer to sit. I told him I knew everything, and I demanded to hear his side. To my surprise, he didn't deny it. He didn't try to shift blame or sugarcoat anything. He admitted they had an affair, said it was casual fun at first, then turned complicated. As he spoke, I felt my rage boil over. I lunged at him, and though I'm not a violent person by nature, I couldn't stop myself. My fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. He didn't fight back, just held up his hands, pleading for me to calm down. Something about his willingness to accept the beating made me pause. He said he knew it was wrong, but that Rachel had always insisted I was distant and unambitious. Those words stung more than any physical blow could. I backed away, breathing hard, my knuckles throbbing. My mind reeled as I wondered if Rachel had told him I was worthless, so her betrayal seemed justified. He mumbled an apology, insisted he hadn't seen her in months. I stared at this stranger who had upended my life and felt an emptiness that frightened me. Without another word, I left, my head pounding with a mixture of fury and despair. Days turned into a haze of legal consultations and tense phone calls from Rachel. She insisted we meet in person, claiming she owed me the full truth. Morbid curiosity compelled me to agree. We met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, neutral ground where neither of us had any memories. She arrived looking worn, guilt etched across her face. But I refused to pity her. I was past pity. I was past heartbreak. I wanted to hear her justifications, to catalog each lie, each rationalization. She recounted how the affair started as a drunken fling at a work conference. She claimed she regretted it immediately but found herself drawn to the danger, the thrill of hiding something. Over time, it became routine, and she admitted she stopped feeling guilty. Boredom, she repeated, was her reason. My mind reeled. The mundanity of our life wasn't enough for her. She wanted more adrenaline. I listened, letting her pour out every detail, my face betraying no emotion. But inside, I seethed. She begged for another chance, argued that she now realized how much she loved me, how much she valued our life. My thoughts drifted to the years I spent saving for our first home, the nights I massaged her tired feet after her long shifts, the mornings I made her breakfast in bed. Was any of it real, or was I just a background character in her search for constant excitement? As she wept, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as though I was watching a movie. "We can rebuild," she said, her eyes shining with desperate hope. I asked her if she'd have confessed at all had she not gotten bored of Gregory. She froze, and in that moment, I knew her tears were less about regret and more about losing her comfort zone. I stood up, ignoring the curious stares of a few patrons who'd overheard fragments of our tense conversation. I told Rachel I had no intention of forgiving her, that we were done. The anguish on her face was immediate, but I felt no satisfaction, only the hollow ache of finality. I reminded her that she'd broken something that couldn't be fixed, that her boredom had cost us everything we had built. She begged, even tried to grab my hand, but I jerked away. I walked out of that cafe, letting the door slam shut on her pleas. Outside, the sky was overcast, a fitting backdrop for the storm raging inside me. My phone buzzed with her frantic texts. I deleted them all without reading. A new kind of resolve took shape within me. There would be no reconciliation. She'd made a choice, and now she would face the consequences. I threw myself into the divorce process with a singular focus. I gathered evidence of her infidelity. Emails, text messages, phone records, everything I could find. I wanted to ensure there was no doubt about why this marriage was ending. My lawyer commended my diligence and advised me that in our state, the details of adultery might influence alimony decisions. Good, I thought. She didn't deserve a dime. Rachel tried to talk to me multiple times, showed up at my workplace once, even cornered me in the parking lot, but I brushed her off. I felt a flicker of guilt every time I saw her tear-streaked face, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her 4-year secret. Meanwhile, I blocked Gregory on all my social media, not that he reached out anyway. I suspect he wanted to forget the entire ordeal as much as I did, or perhaps more. As the court date approached, Rachel's pleas grew more frantic. She left handwritten letters in my mailbox, pleading with me to consider counseling, to think about the good years we'd had. I was unmoved. The only good years that mattered were the ones she hadn't used to lie and cheat. On the morning of the hearing, she showed up with puffy eyes and an air of desperation. My lawyer presented our evidence, and Rachel didn't contest it. The judge, seeing the clear grounds for divorce, set forth the final decree. I watched Rachel as the judge spoke, noting the tremble in her hands and the tears slipping down her cheeks. Maybe in another universe, her sorrow would have awakened empathy in me, but not in this one. The gavel came down, and with it, our marriage officially ended. She whispered something to me in the hallway, but I pretended I didn't hear. After the divorce, I was left with a strange sense of emptiness. I'd spent so much energy preparing for the battle that once it was won, I wasn't sure what to do next. Friends tried to cheer me up, inviting me out for drinks or to set me up on dates, but I wasn't ready. My trust in love was shattered. Late at night, I'd replay the moments of betrayal over in my mind, feeling a dull ache settle in my chest. Sometimes anger flared again, but mostly, I just felt numb. That was until I discovered one final bombshell. Rachel had not only cheated, but had, in fact, tried to push for promotions at work, by cozying up to higher-ups, Gregory among them. One of my acquaintances at her company spilled the beans after too many drinks, saying how everyone suspected she used personal relationships for professional gain. My blood boiled anew. In that moment, I knew my revenge wasn't over. I compiled every incriminating text, every rumor, and every hint of her manipulations at the office. Then I sent it all, anonymously, to the company's HR department and several executives. Word spread quickly. Rachel was investigated for misconduct and eventually let go. Her reputation in the industry took a lethal blow. I never saw her again, but I heard she moved back in with her parents, struggling to find stable work. The knowledge of her downfall felt like a final stroke of justice. I let go of the anger I'd harbored for so long, knowing she'd reaped what she sowed. Moving on wasn't easy, but I did it without regrets. She'd chosen her path out of boredom, and in the end, I found a new beginning, one forged from self-respect and peace.